North Africa, May 1943. Klaus Becker stood with his hands raised above his head, American rifles pointed at his chest. He was 22, captured after 3 days without water in the Tunisian desert. His unit had told him what happened to prisoners, the stories of immediate punishment, of harsh treatment worse than combat. He closed his eyes and waited for the end. Instead, an American soldier handed him a canteen. The water was cold, clean, impossibly abundant. Klaus drank until his stomach cramped and realized that everything he'd been taught about the enemy might be a lie. The surrender happened at dawn. Klaus and 47 other German soldiers emerged from behind a destroyed supply depot, their uniforms caked with sand and dried blood, their ammunition exhausted, their officer dead from wounds sustained 3 days earlier. American forces had surrounded their position during the night tanks and infantry closing a perimeter. That left no avenue for retreat. The regiment's propaganda officer had been clear about what awaited prisoners. Americans showed no mercy to captured German forces. They were undisciplined soldiers who would mistreat prisoners out of hatred and racial prejudice. Better to fight to the last man than to surrender and face what was coming. But Klaus's friend, Werner Schmidt, had collapsed from dehydration the previous evening. 2 others were wounded and unable to walk. The choice was surrender or watch their comrades die in the sand while achieving nothing. Klaus was the most senior soldier remaining, a corporal, barely qualified to give orders, but forced into command by circumstance. He made the decision. They would walk out with hands raised and hope that propaganda had been exaggerating. The American soldiers who accepted their surrender were younger than Klaus expected. Farm boys from Oklahoma and factory workers from Ohio, most looking as exhausted as the Germans felt. A lieutenant approached, a man perhaps 25 years old, with dust covering his uniform and fatigue written across his face. The lieutenant spoke in broken German. Waffen nieder. Keine Bügen. Weapons down. Don't move. The Germans complied, dropping rifles and pistols that were empty anyway. They stood in the morning sun, hands raised, waiting for whatever came next. Klaus watched the American soldiers for signs of what his propaganda training had promised: hatred, cruelty, the treatment of enemies who'd bombed Allied cities and submarines that sank merchant ships. Instead, the lieutenant gestured to his medics. Check their wounded first, and get water for all of them. These men look half dead. Within minutes, American medics were examining Werner, starting in 4, loading him onto a stretcher. Other medics moved among the German prisoners, offering canteens, checking for injuries. Klaus accepted water from a soldier who couldn't have been older than 19, a kid who nodded and said something in English that Klaus did not understand, but whose tone suggested simple human acknowledgement. Klaus drank. The water was cold, impossibly cold in the desert heat, and tasted clean, free from the chemical tablets they'd used to purify water from questionable sources. He drank until a medic gently took the canteen back, explaining in gestures that drinking too fast would make him sick. Around him, German soldiers were drinking, some crying from relief, others staring at their captors with expressions mixing fear and confusion. This wasn't what they'd been promised. This wasn't the enemy they'd been taught to expect. From the capture point, they were loaded onto trucks, military transports with canvas covers that provided shade from the merciless North African sun. The trucks moved in convoy across desert roads, kicking up dust that filtered through the canvas and settled on everything. Klaus sat beside another prisoner, a private named Friedrich, who'd been conscripted from a farming village in Bavaria. "They're taking us to a camp," Friedrich whispered in German. "What do you think they'll do to us there?" Klaus didn't answer. He'd heard the same stories Friedrich had about harsh treatment, about prison camps where enemies were worked until they collapsed. But those stories didn't match the medics who'd treated Werner, the water given freely, the American soldiers who looked at them with something closer to pity than hatred. The convoy reached a processing center by afternoon, a collection of tents surrounded by wire fences, with armed guards at regular intervals. The prisoners were unloaded and lined up for registration. American officers with clipboards moved down the line, recording names, ranks, units. Klaus gave his information in halting. English learned from 3 years of mandatory language instruction that he'd never expected to use this way. Name? An officer asked. Klaus Becker, Corporal, Afrika Korps, 21st Panzer Division. The officer wrote methodically. Age? 22. Hometown? Hamburg. The questioning continued service history, medical conditions, next of kin. It was bureaucratic rather than aggressive, the tone of men processing paperwork rather than interrogating enemies. When Klaus finished, he was directed to a tent where German prisoners sat waiting for the next phase. Inside the tent, the atmosphere was tense. 50 men sat on the ground, conversing in low voices, sharing rumors about what awaited them. An older soldier, perhaps 35, which seemed ancient to Klaus, claimed to have heard they'd be sent to camps in America, shipped across the Atlantic to detention facilities far from the fighting. America? Friedrich said. Why would they send us there? The older soldier shrugged. Distance. They don't want us escaping and rejoining our units. In America, we're thousands of miles from any German forces. Klaus listened, but said nothing. The idea of America seemed impossible, the country that existed in propaganda films as a land of degeneracy and weakness, the nation that supposedly couldn't sustain a war effort because its people were too soft. Yet those soft Americans had just defeated his unit in open combat, had provided medical care and water without hesitation, had processed them with bureaucratic efficiency that suggested a well-organized system. 2 weeks later, Klaus stood on the deck of a transport ship watching the African coast disappear behind them. The voyage to America would take approximately 3 weeks crossing the Mediterranean to Gibraltar, then Atlantic waters to New York. 3 weeks confined to a ship with hundreds of other German prisoners, all sharing the same uncertainty about what awaited them. The ship was crowded, but not inhumane. Prisoners slept in converted cargo holds on triple-stacked bunks, the air thick with the smell of diesel fuel and unwashed bodies. But they were fed twice daily rations that were simple but adequate. Bread and soup, occasionally meat, coffee that was weak but hot. More food than Klaus had eaten in the final weeks before capture. American guards maintained order, but without the harshness Klaus had expected. They were mostly older men, too old for combat duty, assigned to guard duty that kept them away from fighting. Some spoke a little German. Others communicated through gestures and the universal language of daily routine. On the 5th day at sea, Klaus stood at the rail during the brief period when prisoners were allowed on deck for fresh air. Beside him, Werner had recovered from his dehydration and was slowly regaining strength. They watched the ocean roll past, gray-green water stretching to horizons that curved with the Earth's curvature. "Do you think we'll survive this?" Werner asked quietly. Klaus considered the question. According to propaganda, they should already be dead worked to death or subjected to treatment that made death preferable. Instead, they were on a ship crossing the Atlantic, fed and housed and treated like logistical challenges rather than hated enemies. "I think," Klaus said slowly, "that we've been lied to about many things." Werner was quiet for a moment. What if everything was lies? What if the leadership told us falsehoods about the Americans, the British, everything? Klaus didn't answer because the implications were too vast. If the propaganda about American treatment of prisoners was false, what else was false? The certainty of victory? The righteousness of their cause? The necessity of the war itself? A guard approached, gesturing that their time on deck was ending. Klaus and Werner returned below, descending into the converted cargo hold, where hundreds of German soldiers waited in cramped proximity, all wrestling with similar questions. New York Harbor appeared through morning fog like something from a dream. Klaus stood on deck with other prisoners, watching the Statue of Liberty emerge from the mist-green copper, oxidized by decades of weather, torch raised above a harbor that had received millions of immigrants and was now receiving enemies. The symbolism wasn't lost on Klaus. He'd been taught that America was weak, divided, incapable of sustaining industrial production necessary for modern warfare. Yet the harbor before him suggested something else: massive cranes loading and unloading cargo, ships of every description moving with coordinated efficiency, a city skyline in the distance that spoke of industrial capacity beyond anything he'd seen in Germany. They docked at a military pier where American soldiers waited with the same bureaucratic organization that had characterized every interaction since capture. The prisoners were unloaded in groups, processed through customs procedures adapted for military use, and loaded onto trains for transport to camps throughout the American interior. Klaus's group was assigned to a camp in Texas, a place he'd heard of only from Western films shown occasionally in German cinemas. Cowboys and deserts, and a frontier mythology that seemed absurd compared to European civilization. Yet here he was, an enemy prisoner being transported across a continent to a state whose very existence had seemed fictional. The train journey took 4 days. The prisoners rode in passenger cars rather than cattle cars, actual seats with windows that allowed them to watch America unfold outside the glass. Through Pennsylvania farmland and Ohio factory towns, across the Mississippi River, and into plains that stretched endless beneath skies wider than anything Klaus had known. American guards walked the aisles periodically, but without apparent tension. Some brought food from the dining car: sandwiches and fruit, coffee and water. They spoke to the prisoners in simple English, asking if anyone needed anything, maintaining order through presence rather than threat. Klaus sat beside Friedrich, both watching the landscape pass. The abundance struck them most forcefully: farms that looked prosperous rather than struggling, towns with intact buildings rather than bomb damage, people going about daily life as if war were a distant concern rather than immediate reality. In Germany, Klaus said quietly, there is rationing, shortages, every resource dedicated to the war effort. Here, it looks like peacetime. Friedrich nodded. The propaganda said America couldn't sustain a war, that their economy was collapsing, their people divided and weak. This doesn't look collapsed. It was the cognitive dissonance that thousands of German prisoners were experiencing, the disconnect between what they'd been taught and what they were witnessing. America was supposed to be on the verge of defeat, its industrial capacity inadequate, its people too soft for sustained conflict. Instead, they were riding through a country that looked economically robust, industrially formidable, capable of producing the ships and tanks and aircraft that were pushing German forces back across Europe. The camp appeared through heat shimmer on a June afternoon: rows of barracks surrounded by wire fencing, guard towers at regular intervals, a water tower visible above the surrounding flatness. Camp Herm, established in 1943 specifically to house German prisoners of war captured in North Africa, and, increasingly, in Italy. The train stopped at a siding. Klaus and 500 other German prisoners disembarked onto a platform where Texas heat hit them like a physical force. It was different from North African heat: humid rather than dry, the air thick enough to feel resistance when breathing. American officers organized them into formation not aggressively, but with the practiced efficiency of men who'd processed thousands of prisoners. They were marched through gates into the camp proper, where more barracks waited, each housing approximately 50 men. Klaus was assigned to Barrack 7, a wooden structure raised on blocks to allow air circulation beneath. Inside, 2 rows of cots stretched the length of the building, each with a thin mattress, a pillow, and 2 blankets. Footlockers at the end of each cot provided storage for personal items, though most prisoners had nothing to store. The camp commander, a colonel whose name Klaus didn't catch, addressed them in the mess hall that evening. He spoke in English, with a translator providing German. You are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. You will be treated fairly and humanely. You will work agricultural labor primarily, helping with crops and livestock. You will be paid a small wage. You will receive adequate food and medical care. You will have access to mail service to write home. Recreation is available, sports equipment, a library, religious services. The colonel paused, letting the translator catch up. I know what you've been told about American treatment of prisoners. I know the propaganda you've heard. You'll find it doesn't match reality. Work hard, follow rules, and your time here will be bearable. Some of you may even find it preferable to what you left behind. The prisoners listened in silence. The colonel's words contradicted every expectation, every story they'd believed. Klaus looked around at the mess hall, clean, well lit, with tables and benches that suggested organized meal service rather than chaos. After the colonel departed, American soldiers distributed dinner beef stew with vegetables, bread with butter, coffee, and milk. Klaus stared at his plate, unable to process the abundance. This was more meat than he'd seen in a single meal since before the war began. The bread was white, soft, clearly made from real wheat rather than sawdust substitutes. Friedrich sat beside him, equally stunned. This is what they feed prisoners? Klaus took a bite. The stew was hot, well seasoned, the meat tender. It was better than most meals he'd eaten during training, better than field rations, better than what civilians in Hamburg had been eating for years. Around the mess hall, 500 German prisoners ate in near silence, confronting the same realization. They'd been prepared for starvation rations, for treatment designed to break them. Instead, they were being fed better than German soldiers in combat zones. Days found their rhythm. Wake at 6 to the sound of a bugle. Breakfast in the mess hall at 6:30. Work assignments beginning at 7. Klaus was assigned to agricultural labor picking cotton in fields that stretched to horizons where heat created mirages that looked like water. The work was hard. Texas summer heat was relentless, the sun pressing down with weight that made breathing difficult. But the guards provided water, breaks every hour, salt tablets to prevent heat exhaustion, shade tents where prisoners could rest during the hottest afternoon hours. Klaus worked beside Werner and Friedrich, moving through cotton rows with the monotonous rhythm of manual labor. American civilian supervisors, farmers who'd contracted for prison labor, watched, but didn't drive them with cruelty. The pace was steady but sustainable, the expectations clear but reasonable. During breaks, Klaus observed the guards. They were mostly older men, and those classified as unfit for combat men with injuries, chronic conditions, or essential skills that kept them stateside. They maintained discipline, but without hostility. Some joked with prisoners who spoke English. Others simply ensured work continued without incident. At noon, trucks arrived with lunch sandwiches and fruit, water and lemonade. The prisoners sat in the shade, eating food that continued to astonish them with its abundance. Klaus bit into an apple crisp, sweet, fresh, and wondered when German civilians had last seen fresh fruit. "You know what bothers me?" Werner said, wiping sweat from his face. "This is how they treat enemies. Imagine how they treat their own people." The observation settled over the group. If America could afford to feed prisoners well, to provide adequate housing and medical care, and pay wages for work, what did that suggest about their overall capacity? About the war's likely outcome? By midsummer, Klaus's understanding of reality had shifted fundamentally. The propaganda that shaped his worldview depicting Americans as weak, cruel, racially divided, industrially inadequate dissolved in the face of daily experience. He watched American efficiency in camp operations, the supply chains that ensured adequate food and materials, the medical care that treated prisoners and American personnel equally, the recreational programs that included sports equipment, musical instruments, books in German. The camp had a library. Klaus spent evenings reading German literature, that American authorities had somehow acquired and made available. He read Goethe and Schiller, reminded of a Germany that existed before the regime, a culture that propaganda had claimed to preserve, but had actually corrupted. He also read American newspapers that the camp received censored from military information, but still revealing. Articles about industrial production, about women working in factories, about bond drives and scrap metal collection. America wasn't collapsing. America was mobilizing with terrifying effectiveness. Klaus wrote letters home, knowing they'd be censored, but wanting his family to know he was alive and safe. He described the camp without mentioning the abundant censors would remove that. He said he was healthy, that treatment was fair, that they shouldn't worry. What he couldn't write was the larger truth, that everything they believed was false, that the enemy was stronger than propaganda admitted, that the war was almost certainly lost, that the regime had led them into catastrophe based on delusions about American weakness. Occasionally, local ranchers came to the camp seeking labor for specialized work. Klaus was selected for a 2-week assignment at a ranch 20 miles from camp, helping with cattle roundup and fence repair. He and 5 other prisoners were transported by truck, accompanied by 2 guards who seemed more interested in preventing escape than in harsh supervision. The rancher was a man named Tom Caldwell, 60 years old, who'd been working cattle since before Klaus was born. He spoke no German. Klaus spoke limited English. They communicated through gestures and the universal language of physical work. Caldwell taught Klaus to rope, to ride, to repair barbed wire fencing that stretched across property, measured in square miles rather than acres. The work was harder than cotton picking, but more varied, more engaging. Klaus found himself enjoying it, the physical challenge, the skill required, the satisfaction of repairing fence lines that would stand against cattle and weather. In the evenings, Caldwell's wife served dinner beef and potatoes, vegetables from their garden, bread that rivaled anything Klaus remembered from home. They ate at the rancher's table, prisoners and guards together, while Caldwell talked about cattle prices and weather patterns and the challenges of maintaining a ranch when so many young men were overseas fighting. Klaus listened, understanding perhaps half the words, but grasping the larger meaning. This man had no particular hatred for German prisoners. He needed labor, they provided it, and in return, he treated them with the same practical courtesy he'd show any workers. There was no ideology, no racial hatred, just the pragmatic relationship of employer and employee adapted to wartime circumstances. On the final evening, Caldwell gave each prisoner a package of cigarettes and candy bars, luxuries that were rationed in America, but apparently available enough to share with enemies. Klaus accepted the gift, struggling to express gratitude in inadequate English. Caldwell waved off the thanks. "You boys worked hard. Fair pay for fair work." The simplicity of the exchange struck Klaus forcefully. Fair pay for fair work. The regime had promised many things: glory, honor, racial superiority, territorial expansion. But it hadn't promised basic fairness, the simple human recognition that work deserved compensation, that enemies were still people entitled to dignity. Mail call became the most anticipated event of each week. Letters from Germany took 6 to 8 weeks to arrive, censored by both German and American authorities, but still connecting prisoners to the world they'd left behind. Klaus received his first letter in August from his mother in Hamburg. The envelope was thin, the paper poor quality, the handwriting shaky. She wrote that she and his father were surviving despite hardships. The bombing had destroyed their neighborhood, but they'd found shelter with relatives. Food was scarce. His brother, 2 years younger, had been conscripted and sent east. She didn't know where. She asked if he was being treated well, if he had enough to eat, if the Americans were cruel. Reading between the censored lines, Klaus understood she expected confirmation of propaganda stories about prisoner mistreatment. He wrote back carefully, knowing censors would read every word. He said he was healthy, that the work was hard but manageable, that he was receiving adequate food and shelter. He couldn't tell her the truth, that he ate better than she did, that America's abundance made Germany's deprivation starkly visible, that the war was revealing fundamental truths about which side had sustainable resources. Other prisoners received similar letters. Stories of bombing, destruction, rationing, losses. Friedrich learned his father had died during an air raid. Werner's hometown had been evacuated entirely. His family relocated to a rural area where they were struggling to survive. The contrast between prisoner experience and civilian experience in Germany became increasingly apparent. Klaus and his fellow prisoners were safer in captivity than German civilians were in their homeland. They ate better, had more secure shelter, faced less immediate danger. The irony was almost unbearable. By autumn, conversations among prisoners began shifting. The hardcore believers in the regime, men who joined enthusiastically, who maintained faith in ultimate victory, became isolated minorities. Most prisoners were confronting uncomfortable truths. Klaus participated in these discussions during evening hours when prisoners gathered in barracks or recreation areas. The conversations were careful, even among prisoners. There were informers who reported defeatist talk to camp authorities or, worse, to German POW leadership that maintained regime authority within the camp hierarchy. But doubts spread nonetheless. How could America sustain this treatment of prisoners while also producing the ships, tanks, aircraft, and weapons defeating German forces across multiple fronts? How could a nation supposedly weakened by racial division and economic collapse maintain such obvious abundance? Some prisoners clung to propaganda explanations. This was all theater, they insisted. America was concentrating resources on prisoner camps to deceive them, to break their will. Real America was collapsing just as the regime predicted. But Klaus had watched supply trucks arrive daily with food and materials. He'd seen American guards who looked well-fed and adequately equipped. He'd read newspapers describing industrial production numbers that dwarfed German capacity. The evidence accumulated until denial became impossible. Werner expressed what many were thinking during a late evening conversation. We were told America was weak. They're not weak. We were told they'd collapse economically. Their economy is supporting a war on 2 continents while feeding prisoners better than our own civilians eat. We were told they lacked industrial capacity. They're building ships faster than submarines can sink them, aircraft faster than we can shoot them down. He paused, voice dropping to a whisper. We were lied to about everything. And now we re-encamps thousands of miles from home while our families starve and our cities burn. Klaus had no counter-argument. The propaganda had been systematic and thorough, but it hadn't withstood contact with reality. American treatment of prisoners wasn't just humane, it was casual, the default behavior of a nation wealthy enough to afford generosity toward enemies. December brought Christmas, and with it, evidence of American capacity that struck Klaus as almost obscene given what he knew about conditions in Germany. The camp organized a celebration trees cut from local forests and decorated, special meals prepared, care packages assembled for distribution. On Christmas Eve, the mess hall served a feast that exceeded anything Klaus had experienced since before the war. Turkey and ham, mashed potatoes and gravy, vegetables, pies, and cakes. American guards sat at tables alongside prisoners, sharing the meal without apparent tension. Carols were sung in both German and English. Silent Night, originating from German tradition, but adopted universally. O, come all the faithful, in Latin that transcended national boundaries. For a few hours, the distinctions between captor and captive blurred into shared humanity, recognizing a holy day older than their conflict. Klaus sat beside Friedrich, both overwhelmed by the abundance and the gesture. This was enemy generosity that made no strategic sense unless viewed through a lens that recognized common humanity despite being at war. After dinner, packages arrived assembled by American relief organizations and distributed to prisoners. Each contained cigarettes, candy, personal items like soap and toothbrushes, and letters from American families expressing hope that prisoners would be treated well and would someday return home to their own families. Klaus opened his package slowly, examining each item. A letter from a family in Iowa explained they had 3 sons serving overseas and hoped that enemy soldiers were showing their boys the same mercy Americans showed German prisoners. The letter wished him a Merry Christmas and expressed hope the war would end soon so everyone could go home. He read the letter 3 times, struggling to reconcile it with everything he'd been taught. These were enemies. They should hate him. Their sons were fighting against his country. Yet they hoped he was being treated well, wished him a Merry Christmas, recognized that he had family worrying about him, just as they worried about their sons. Friedrich read over his shoulder. How do we fight people like this? How did we ever think we could defeat a nation that treats enemies with this kind of dignity? Klaus folded the letter carefully, storing it with other precious items. We can't, he said quietly. We never could have. We were told lies, and we believed them, and now we're here while our country burns. May 1945 brought news that the war in Europe had ended. German forces had surrendered unconditionally. The regime had collapsed. The leadership that had promised ultimate victory had instead delivered absolute defeat. In Camp Herne, the news created complex emotions. Relief that fighting had ended. Anxiety about what came next. Grief for a Germany that existed now only in ruins and memories. And shame growing, unavoidable shame for what they'd supported, however unwittingly. As occupation forces took control of Germany, more information emerged. Reports of camps that weren't for prisoners of war, but for civilians. Documentation of policies that had targeted millions for persecution. Evidence of actions that made close as assumptions about justified warfare collapse into horror at what his government had actually done. American authorities showed German prisoners films and photographs documenting what Allied forces found as they advanced across Germany. Klaus watched in a camp theater, unable to look away from images that destroyed any remaining illusions about the regime's moral authority. Some prisoners denied it, claimed it was propaganda, that victors always demonized the defeated. But Klaus couldn't maintain that denial. The evidence was too overwhelming, too carefully documented, too consistent across multiple sources. He thought about his time in the regime's military, his service in North Africa, his capture and transportation to America. He'd fought believing he was defending his country against enemies who threatened German civilization. Instead, he'd been defending a government that committed atrocities while accusing others of the very crimes it was perpetrating. The shame was almost unbearable, not just for the regime, but for his complicity, however unwitting. He'd worn the uniform. He'd followed orders. He believed the propaganda that depicted enemies as less than human, while his own government was actually treating millions as less than human. As 1945 progressed toward 1946, the question of repatriation became pressing. The war was over. Prisoners would be returned to Germany. But what awaited them there? A country in ruins, economically devastated, politically occupied, morally stained by revelations that would take generations to process. Some prisoners wanted to return despite everything, to find surviving family, to help rebuild, to face whatever waited in their homeland. Others, like Klaus, began exploring whether staying in America might be possible. The process wasn't simple. Immigration laws were clear. Enemy aliens couldn't simply choose to remain. But exceptions existed for those with special skills, those who demonstrated good behavior during captivity, those who could find American sponsors willing to vouch for them. Klaus had maintained good behavior throughout his captivity. He'd learned English through persistent study. He'd worked hard on every assignment. He'd developed relationships with guards and civilian supervisors who knew him as reliable and honest. Tom Caldwell, the rancher who'd employed him during that 2-week assignment, visited the camp in December 1945. He found Klaus and made an offer. "Come work for me permanent. I'll sponsor your residency application. I need hands, you know the work, and I trust you." Klaus struggled to respond in English adequate to the moment. The offer represented not just employment, but acceptance. An American rancher willing to sponsor a former enemy, to navigate bureaucratic processes, to bring Klaus into his community as something more than a prisoner. "Why?" Klaus finally asked. "Why do this for enemy?" Caldwell removed his hat, wiping his forehead. "Son, the war's over. You boys didn't start it, your government did. You fought because you were told to, same as our boys. Now it's done, and I need good workers. You're a good worker. Simple as that." Klaus accepted. The paperwork took months: immigration applications, security clearances, sponsor agreements. But in June 1946, Klaus Becker walked out of Camp Hearn, not as a repatriated prisoner, but as a German immigrant beginning a new life in America. Klaus worked for Tom Caldwell for 8 years, learning ranching from a man who treated him not as a former enemy, but as a ranch hand learning a trade. He married in 1952 an American woman whose brother had been wounded in Germany, but who looked past Klaus's nationality to see an individual. They raised 3 children on a small ranch Klaus eventually purchased with savings and a loan that Caldwell co-signed. The children grew up knowing their father's story, that he'd been an enemy soldier, had expected harsh treatment in captivity, had instead found humanity that transformed his understanding of the world. Klaus became an American citizen in 1955, taking an oath to a country that had once been his enemy, but had treated him with more dignity than his own government ever had. He never forgot that he was German by birth, never denied his heritage. But he was American by choice, by gratitude for treatment he hadn't deserved, but had received anyway. He returned to Germany once, in 1963, to visit his mother who'd survived the war and its aftermath. Hamburg was rebuilt by then, modern and prosperous under Allied occupation that became partnership. His mother cried when she saw him, grateful he'd survived and thrived. She asked him to stay, to return to Germany permanently. Klaus considered it for approximately 1 minute before shaking his head. America was home now. The country that had every reason to treat him harshly had instead treated him fairly, had given him opportunities, had accepted him despite his past. Klaus Becker died in 2003 at age 82, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who were fully American but carried his story. His obituary mentioned his military service briefly, focusing instead on his ranching career, his family, his community involvement. But to those who knew him well, his real story was about the transformation that occurred when propaganda met reality. He'd expected execution or harsh treatment. He'd received adequate food, fair working conditions, and recognition of his basic humanity despite being an enemy. That treatment hadn't made him love America reflexively or hate Germany automatically. It had made him understand that the regime had lied about American cruelty, about American weakness, about the righteousness of German cause. Those lies had cost millions of lives and destroyed German civilization as thoroughly as any defeat. American treatment of prisoners wasn't motivated by naive compassion or strategic generosity. It was motivated by adherence to international law, by practical recognition that well-treated prisoners caused fewer problems, and by a fundamental belief that human beings deserved basic dignity regardless of which uniform they wore. For Klaus and thousands like him, that basic dignity was transformative. It broke propaganda's hold, revealed the regime's falsehoods, and demonstrated that enemies could recognize each other's humanity even while at war. The lesson wasn't that America was perfect or that American actions were always justified. The lesson was that how you treat enemies reveals more about your values then how you treat friends that basic human dignity costs less than systematic cruelty, and that the aftermath of war requires recognizing that former enemies must somehow become neighbors. Camp Hearn closed in 1946, its barracks eventually demolished, its purpose fulfilled. The land returned to agricultural use, the buildings were torn down, the evidence of thousands of German prisoners gradually disappeared into Texas soil. But the legacy persisted in men like Klaus Becker, who chose to stay in relationships formed between enemies who discovered shared humanity, in the quiet acknowledgement that war's categories friend and enemy victor and vanquished were temporary compared to the permanent truth of human dignity. In archives and libraries, letters remain written by German prisoners to families back home, carefully censored but still revealing. They describe adequate food, fair treatment, confusion at the disconnect between propaganda and reality. They document the transformation that occurred when men prepared for harsh treatment, instead encountered basic decency. Those letters, preserved now for historians, tell a story about the power of treating enemies humanely, not because it's strategically advantageous, though it often is, not because it wins hearts and minds, though it sometimes does, but because human dignity isn't conditional on nationality or circumstance. It's inherent to being human. Klaus Becker stood with hands raised in the North African desert, expecting the worst and finding something better. That moment of unexpected humanity changed his life, transformed his understanding, and ultimately contributed to healing that was necessary after history's most destructive war. The Texas sky still stretches vast and blue over land where Camp Hearn once stood. And somewhere in the records, Klaus S. Story remains a German soldier who expected execution and found instead an enemy nation that chose dignity over hatred, fairness over revenge, and the long difficult work of peace over the temporary satisfaction of cruelty.